she told her friends she would rather be in the ground than marry him. Not in an argument, not in a moment of heat, in a laughing, wine-loose video call with her girls, while the man she said it about was standing 12 feet away in the hallway, still in his work clothes, holding his keys, not making a sound. He didn't yell, he didn't confront her, he didn't send a single text. He waited until she left for the gym, packed what mattered in 2 boxes, left his key on the kitchen counter, and disappeared without a word, because a man who has been quietly invisible for 3 years knows exactly how to vanish. What his girlfriend didn't know, what her whole family didn't know, was that the accountant they had spent 3 years dismissing as forgettable was the silent money behind the one thing they were most proud of. And the moment he walked out that door, he didn't just leave the relationship. He took the floor with him. Here's what I need to know before we go any further. How does a man stay that quiet for that long? And what does it look like when he finally decides to stop? If you already know this one is going to be something special, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It helps this story reach someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you're new here, because we do this every week, and drop your city in the comments. I want to know where in the world you're watching from today. Now let me take you back to a Thursday evening in Charlotte, North Carolina, to a hallway, a half-open door, and the last 12 feet of a 3-year relationship that only one person knew was already over. Terence Lawson was not the kind of man who announced himself when he walked into a room. He never had been. He was the kind of man who fixed things before you noticed they were broken, who remembered how you took your coffee, who handled the details of a shared life so quietly that after a while the life just felt like it ran itself. 34 years old, licensed CPA, a man whose entire professional existence was built on the ability to see what other people overlooked. He was good at being invisible. He had never considered that this might be a problem. He came home early that Thursday because of a headache. Nothing dramatic, just a long day, a tight tension behind his left eye, and the particular kind of tiredness that does not come from the body. He had stopped at the light on Tryon Street and decided simply that he was done for the day. He texted no one. He just turned toward home. The apartment was on the 7th floor of a mid-rise off Southend. Terence had found it 2 years ago, signed the lease himself, furnished it over 3 weekends, with the particular care of a man who understands that a home is a balance sheet. Every choice either adds value or it doesn't. Brianna had moved in 14 months after that, paying half the utilities, calling it theirs. He had never corrected her. The door was unlocked when he got there. He registered it without reaction, turned the handle, stepped inside. He could hear her from the hallway. The bedroom door was half open. Her voice was bright and carrying. The voice she used with her girls, animated and loose, spilling out into the living room like music from a neighboring apartment. He caught the layered sound of a video call, multiple voices overlapping, the particular energy of a group of women who had been on the phone long enough to stop performing and start talking. He set his keys on the counter. He stood at the edge of the hallway. He was not trying to listen, but he heard it anyway. One of the voices asked the question like it was a joke. "When are you and Terence finally going to do something?" The call got loud. Somebody laughed. And then Brianna's voice dropped into that particular register. The one that sounds like a whisper but carries through walls just fine. "Marry Terence, I would rather be in the ground. I mean that. He is a good man. He is a sweet man. But I cannot spend my life with somebody who counts other people's money for a living. Damon keeps telling me I'm wasting my best years. Honestly, he's not wrong. The call erupted. Someone said, "Girl, you are wrong for that." Someone else said, "But you know it is true, though." Brianna laughed the way people laugh when they have said the truest, most private thing they believe, and they are relieved to finally have it out in the air. "He will be fine," she said. "Men like that always land somewhere." Terence stood in the hallway for what felt like a long time, though it was probably 4 seconds. He did not feel the floor shift beneath him. He did not feel his chest crack open. He felt something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. The specific sensation of a decision arriving fully formed, like it had been waiting in a room just off to the side of his life, and had finally found the open door. He walked back to the front entrance. He rode the elevator down to the parking garage. He drove to the hardware store on the other side of the neighborhood and bought 2 cardboard boxes. He sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes. Then he drove back. Brianna's spin class was Thursdays at 6:30. She was never home before 8. He moved through the apartment with the efficiency of a man who had packed and unpacked his own life enough times to know exactly what mattered. His documents, every folder, every agreement, every account statement, his laptop, a photograph of his grandmother in a small silver frame, the one she had given him when he passed his CPA exam. 3 suits still in their dry cleaning bags, his toiletries, the charger on the nightstand. He did not take the art they had picked out together. He did not take the throw blanket she had ordered from somewhere online and left draped over his side of the couch. He did not take anything that could be contested, anything that would give her a reason to call. He left his key on the kitchen counter in the center, where she would see it the moment she came through the door. He did not write a note. He did not send a text. He carried the 2 boxes to his car, rode back down in the elevator, and pulled out of the parking garage at 7:52 in the evening. He drove to a hotel on the other side of Uptown and checked in with the same face he used for everything else. Steady, settled, giving nothing away. Brianna came home at 8:40. She came home to a key on the counter, a closet with gaps in it, and a silence that had a different quality than the silence Terence usually left behind. But to understand what that silence actually meant, to understand what Terence Lawson had just walked away from and what he had never once mentioned, you have to go back to the beginning of those 3 years, back to the first Sunday dinner. Back to the moment the Fossey family looked at him and decided he was someone they did not have to take seriously. They were wrong. They just did not know it yet. Terence Lawson grew up in a house where the heat sometimes worked, and the water always did, which his mother said was the more important of the 2. They lived in the West Charlotte neighborhood where everybody knew everybody, and nobody had much, but most people had enough. And his mother raised him with the particular discipline of a woman who understood that a black man in this country needed 2 things above all else, his word and his paperwork. She meant it literally. Every receipt, every agreement, every document got filed. Nothing was thrown away. Terence absorbed that lesson so completely it became architecture, the invisible structure behind everything he built. He put himself through school on scholarships and part-time work, passed his CPA exam on the first attempt at 26, and spent the next several years doing what careful, patient men do. He saved more than he spent, invested more than he saved, and kept his mouth shut about all of it. By the time he was 27, he had formed a private investment LLC through Raymond Cole's firm, a quiet vehicle for holding notes and managing capital, the kind of entity that does not announce itself and does not need to. He funded it slowly, consistently, the way his mother had taught him to do everything else. By the time he met Brianna Fossey at a mutual friend's birthday dinner in the summer 3 years before that Thursday, the LLC held enough to make most people's eyes change. Terence had learned not to test people with that information before he had to. Brianna was magnetic in the way of people who have decided they deserve to be looked at. She laughed easily and moved through a room with the confidence of someone who had always been the most interesting person in it. On their first date, she asked him what he did. He said, "Accounting," and she nodded the way people nod when they have already moved on inside their own heads. He noticed. He did not correct her impression. The first Sunday dinner at her parents' house came about 2 months in. Her mother, Gwen, was warm and welcoming in the distracted way of women managing too many dishes at once. Her father, Leonard, shook Terence's hand with genuine firmness and asked good questions about his work. But it was Damon who set the temperature of the room, and Damon who made clear before the sweet potatoes had even been passed exactly where Terence stood in the family's estimation. Damon was 36 and operated like a man who had confused volume for substance so long ago that the distinction no longer occurred to him. He sat at the head of the table in his parents' house, not his house, and held court like he had earned it. That first evening he talked for 45 minutes about Fosse Capital, about his client list, about a deal he was structuring that was going to be, in his exact words, the biggest thing Charlotte's seen from an independent firm this decade. Nobody asked what the deal was. Nobody needed to. The point was not the deal. The point was Damon, radiating success like a space heater, filling every corner of the room with warmth that belonged to him. At some point, someone asked Terence about his work. Before he could answer, Damon cut across the table with a smile that was technically friendly. "He does accounting," Damon said. "Keeps the books. Everybody needs somebody to keep the books." He picked up his fork. The table moved on. Brianna laughed at something her cousin said across the room. She did not look at Terence. He ate his food. He helped clear the plates. He drove Brianna home and said nothing about any of it. That was the pattern. It did not change in 3 years. It only became more familiar, which is almost the same as becoming invisible. At Damon's firm anniversary party, Terence was introduced as Brianna's boyfriend, no further information offered or solicited. At a cookout the following summer, when a family friend asked what Terence did for work, Brianna answered before he could. "He does numbers," she said, with a small, bright smile. "The kind you wear when you are managing something mildly embarrassing in public." Terence watched Damon across the yard, holding a plate and a drink, and talking loudly to 2 men who were nodding along like he was delivering scripture. The apartment had been Terence's idea and Terence's lease. He had found it, negotiated the terms, and signed his name at the bottom of every page. When Brianna moved in, she transferred half the utilities into her account and started calling it ours, and Terence did not correct her because he was still watching, waiting to see what she would become when she relaxed into the life he had built for them. What she became was comfortable. What she never became was curious. Not about his work, not about his finances, not about the private LLC that had been quietly earning and compounding for 7 years, while she called him a man who counted other people's money. Nobody in Brianna's world ever asked Terence what he actually did. Nobody looked closely enough to find out. That was their first mistake. Then Damon threw a party, and Terence saw something mounted on a wall behind a desk, and the word patience took on an entirely different meaning. The invitation had come through Brianna, as most things connected to Damon did. She had mentioned it on a Tuesday evening while scrolling through her phone, voice casual, like it was nothing. Damon was doing a little investor appreciation thing at the office. Just drinks, just an hour. It would mean a lot to the family if Terence came. She did not say it would mean a lot to her. He noticed that. He said he would be there. The Fosse Capital advisor's office occupied half a floor in a building off East Trade Street, the kind of address that sounded more significant than it looked in person. Damon had decorated it the way men decorate offices when the office is the product. Framed credentials on every available wall, a glass desk that caught the light and threw it back at you, a bar cart positioned just inside the entrance, like a handshake you couldn't refuse. By the time Terence arrived on a Wednesday evening, 6 weeks before that Thursday, the room held about 30 people in business casual, clusters of conversation, the particular energy of a gathering designed to perform prosperity. Damon moved through the room like a man who had rehearsed being himself. He worked every cluster with the same rotation. The warm handshake, the personal detail remembered and deployed, the pivot to the firm's recent performance. And then the laugh, full and easy, the laugh of a man who wanted you to feel lucky to be in the same room as him. He was good at it. Terence could see why it worked. Damon Fosse was the kind of man who made you want to believe in him, even when nothing he said was specific enough to verify. Brianna was circulating on the opposite side of the room, bright and social, her office party smile fully deployed. Damon crossed paths with her twice in the first 20 minutes and introduced her to clients each time. "This is my sister, Brianna. She works in marketing. Isn't she something?" And both times, Brianna glowed under it, the particular warmth of a woman who had spent her whole life standing in her brother's light and calling it sunshine. Terence stood nearby the first time. Damon did not introduce him. The second time, Terence had already drifted toward the drinks. He was not offended. He was watching. He heard Damon before he saw him again, the voice carrying across the room with the confidence of a man who had never once considered lowering it. Damon was standing with a prospective client near the window, a man in a grey blazer who was nodding at the right intervals. Terence positioned himself within earshot near a bookshelf and kept his eyes on his drink. Damon was talking about the firm's anchor accounts. He used that phrase specifically, anchor accounts, and described them as the cornerstone of Fosse Capital's portfolio performance. He said their consistency was what separated this firm from the noise. He said the numbers spoke for themselves. The man in the grey blazer asked if he could see the portfolio summary, and Damon smiled and walked him toward the wall behind the desk. Terence followed at a distance that looked like nothing. The framed portfolio summary hung in the center of the wall, matted and under glass, the kind of display you commission when you want something to look permanent. It listed 4 client accounts by code, no names, just identifiers, along with annualized return figures for each. 2 of the 4 were highlighted in the firm's branded blue. Anchor accounts, the frame's small label read, Core Holdings 24-month performance record. Terence looked at the second code. He recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting. Instantly, without effort, without any possibility of being wrong. It was the identifier for his LLC. He had assigned it himself 7 years ago, a string of numbers and letters that had lived in Raymond Cole's files ever since. He took out his phone. He looked at the screen the way a man looks at a text message. He pressed the camera button. He took the photograph. He put the phone back in his pocket. Then he picked up his drink, crossed the room, and found Damon between conversations near the bar cart. He extended his hand. Damon shook it with the hearty grip he gave everyone, eyes already scanning the room for the next cluster. "Good turnout," Terence said. "Always is," Damon said. "The numbers do the work." He smiled and moved on. Terence smiled back. On the drive home, Brianna talked about the event, who she had spoken to, what Damon had said to a particular client, how well the whole thing had gone. Terence drove and listened and said very little, which was not unusual. She did not notice that he was quieter than normal, because she had never learned the difference. That night, after Brianna fell asleep, Terence sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open. He pulled up the original note agreement from a folder he had kept organized for 7 years. He found the page with the account identifiers. He looked at the second one. It matched the photograph on his phone exactly. $890,000, callable with 30 days' notice, co-signed through Raymond Cole, Esquire, Investment Law, Charlotte, North Carolina. He closed the laptop. He went to bed. He did not call Raymond that night. He did not call him the next week, or the week after that, because he was still watching, still measuring, still deciding whether what he had seen changed anything about how he intended to proceed. Then Thursday came, and Brianna answered that question for him from a hallway away. Raymond Cole's office was on the 14th floor of a building on South Tryon Street, the kind of address that communicated stability without announcing it. The waiting area had dark wood paneling and 2 chairs that had not been reupholstered since they were first chosen because they did not need to be. Everything in Raymond's world was built to last. Terence had always appreciated that about him. He arrived at 9 in the morning, Friday, the day after he had left his key on a kitchen counter and driven away from 3 years of his life without a single word. He had slept 4 hours at the hotel, showered, put on one of the 3 suits he had packed, and eaten a full breakfast at the diner on the corner because he understood, in the practical way he understood most things, that clarity requires fuel. He did not feel dramatic about any of it. He felt precise. Raymond came out to meet him himself rather than sending his assistant, which meant he had already understood from the voicemail that this was not a routine visit. He was a broad-shouldered man of 51 with close-cropped silver hair and reading glasses he wore on a chain around his neck like a man who had stopped pretending he didn't need them. He shook Terence's hand once, firmly, and led him back to the office without small talk. Terence laid it out in the order it had happened. The relationship. The 6 months before he discovered the connection. The happy hour 6 weeks ago and the framed portfolio on the wall. The photograph on his phone, which he set on Raymond's desk and slid across without a word. Raymond looked at it for a long moment, then picked up the note agreement from the file he had already pulled before Terence arrived. He compared the LLC identifier on the photograph to the one on the agreement. He set both documents down. He folded his hands. "That's your account," Raymond said. It was not a question. "That's my account," Terence confirmed. Raymond was quiet for a moment in the way of men who are not processing the information, but deciding how to organize what they already know. He opened his notepad. He began explaining the mechanism in the measured, unhurried tone he used for everything from routine filings to the kind of news that changed the shape of a person's life. The note agreement was clear. Terence held callable investment notes on 2 accounts currently operating under Fosse Capital Advisors Management, accounts that Damon Fosse had accepted as client capital without, apparently, examining the underlying note structure closely enough to identify who sat behind the LLC. The notes totaled $890,000. The call provision required full repayment within 30 days of formal notice. There was no negotiation clause. There was no extension option. The language was airtight because Raymond had written it 7 years ago to be exactly that. Raymond walked him through what would happen if the call was issued, and Damon could not cover it. To produce $890,000 in 30 days without liquid reserves, Damon would have to liquidate active client positions. Liquidating client positions without their explicit consent was a breach of fiduciary duty under North Carolina securities law. A breach of fiduciary duty triggered mandatory disclosure requirements to all current clients. Mandatory disclosure to current clients would require Fosse Capital to report its true assets under management, which without Terence's 2 anchor accounts, would drop from $1.46 million to somewhere under $600,000 in a single business day, a 61% reduction overnight. Terence listened without interrupting. He already knew most of what Raymond was telling him, but there was a difference between knowing a thing and having it confirmed by the man who had built the instrument. He felt the same sensation he had felt at the kitchen counter the night before. Not heat, not triumph, but the particular settling of a weight that had been carried so long it had started to feel like part of the body. Raymond paused. He adjusted his glasses. "There's one other matter," Terence said. He explained the apartment. His name on the lease, Brianna's name on nothing. 14 months of her living there on his signature. He told Raymond he wanted formal notice sent to building management that he was vacating. He specified he did not want Brianna contacted directly. That call, he said, should come from the building. Raymond wrote it down without comment. When Terence finished, Raymond looked up. "Both items, the note call and the lease notice. You want them moving simultaneously?" "Not simultaneously," Terence said. "Sequenced. The note call goes first. The lease notice follows after she has had time to look for help and discovered there isn't any." Raymond looked at him for a moment with the expression of a man who has spent 30 years in investment law and still occasionally encounters a client who surprises him. He picked up his pen. "How do you want to proceed?" Terence looked at the documents on the desk. He looked at the photograph of the framed portfolio on his phone. He thought about the hallway. He thought about the 12 feet. "Carefully," he said, "and all at once." Raymond opened his notepad to a fresh page. The slow burn was over. From this moment forward, everything would move. The plan did not require anger. That was the first thing Terence understood about it. Anger was loud and imprecise and left fingerprints on everything it touched. What this required was sequence. The right actions in the right order, each one triggering the next through mechanisms that already existed in the documents Raymond had drafted 7 years ago. The law would do the work. Terence simply had to set it in motion. He came back to Raymond's office the following Monday. He had spent the weekend at the hotel, not grieving, not second-guessing, but thinking through the architecture of what came next, the same way he thought through any complex reconciliation. Methodically, from the outermost number to the innermost, making sure everything balanced before he signed off. They worked through the sequence together at Raymond's conference table with the note agreement and the apartment lease side by side. The call notice had to go first. That was not a strategic choice. It was a practical one. The call notice was the instrument that removed Damon's financial flaw, and once it was filed, the cascade would begin moving on its own. The apartment notification had to follow after, with enough lag time that Brianna would instinctively turn to Damon for help and find him already drowning. Raymond agreed without elaboration. He had seen enough of these situations to understand the sequencing without needing it explained twice. Raymond spent Tuesday drafting the formal call notice. When he showed it to Terence on Wednesday morning, it was 2 pages of language so clean and so precise it was almost beautiful. The way a correctly structured balance sheet is beautiful to someone who knows what they are looking at. There was no personal name anywhere in the document. The notice originated from the LLC. The LLC had a registered identifier and an address and a filing history and exactly the standing required to issue this demand, and none of that required Terence Lawson's name to appear anywhere at all. Damon would receive a legal instrument from an entity he had apparently never examined closely enough to understand. That fact alone said everything that needed to be said about how Damon ran his firm. Terence read the notice once, slowly. He signed the authorization for Raymond to file. The apartment matter was handled separately with different paperwork. Raymond sent formal written notice to the building management company indicating that the leaseholder intended to vacate at the conclusion of the lease term and would not be renewing. The letter was administrative and routine. It contained no information about Brianna because there was no information about Brianna in any document connected to that apartment. Her name had never appeared on a single page of the lease agreement. She had lived there for 14 months on the strength of Terence's word, and his word was the only thing that had ever held the arrangement together. When that word was gone, the building manager would make a call. Terence would not be the one to make it. On the second day after he left the apartment, Brianna sent him a text. It was casual in the way of someone who was not yet alarmed. "Hey, just checking in, haven't heard from you, everything okay?" He read it. He did not respond. On the third day, she sent another. The register had shifted slightly. The question marks were more frequent. He read that one too. He understood what she was doing, because he had watched her long enough to know how she moved through discomfort. First casual, then social, then persistent, and finally, only when nothing else worked, direct. He was not going to be available for any stage of that progression. He opened a secondary account on Tuesday afternoon to receive the recovered funds when the notes were called and satisfied. He had already decided what a portion of that capital was for. He had been thinking about the church on Beatty's Ford Road for 2 years, the one his grandmother had attended for 40 years before she died, the one with the fellowship hall that sat empty on Saturday mornings, and a congregation that worked hard and saved carefully and still did not always understand how to make their money build something. The workshop had been an idea in the back of his mind since before any of this. Now it was a line item. Raymond filed the call notice on Wednesday morning at 9:47. By noon, Raymond had received confirmation that the document had been transmitted to the registered address of Fosse Capital Advisors on East Trade Street. By 2 in the afternoon, the delivery confirmation came through. The notice had been received at the front desk and signed for by the firm's administrative assistant. Terence was at the hotel when Raymond sent him the confirmation. He read the email. He closed his laptop. He ordered room service, ate at the small desk by the window, and watched Charlotte's midday traffic move below him with the particular stillness of a man who has just released something he has been holding for a very long time. Damon Fosse would open that envelope Thursday morning, and by Thursday afternoon the first domino would already have taken out the second. Damon Fosse opened the envelope on a Thursday morning. He read it once, standing at his desk. Then he sat down and read it again. The language was formal and cold and left no room for interpretation. A formal demand for repayment of callable investment notes totaling $890,000 issued by an LLC he did not recognize, due in full within 30 days. He called his attorney before 10 o'clock. His attorney called back at noon. The notes were real. The call provision was airtight. There was no negotiation clause, no grace period. Beyond the 30 days, no mechanism for appeal. Damon's attorney told him this in the careful tone of a man delivering news he wishes he did not have to deliver. Damon sat in his glass-fronted office and stared at the framed portfolio summary on the wall and said nothing for a long time. Then he started making calls. The problem was the liquidity. Fosse Capital did not have $890,000 in accessible reserves. What the firm had was assets under management, client money invested on behalf of clients, which could not be touched without the client's explicit authorization. To raise the capital to satisfy the call notice, Damon would have to liquidate positions in active client accounts. And under North Carolina securities law, liquidating client positions without consent was not aggressive portfolio management. It was a breach of fiduciary duty. His attorney explained this. Damon said he understood. He did not fully until the next morning. The mandatory AUM disclosure went out to all current clients by Friday afternoon. It was a legal requirement, as once the firm's assets under management changed materially, clients had to be notified. The disclosure showed a drop from $1.46 million to under $600,000 in a single document on a single business day. Two of Fosse Capital's newest corporate clients called within the hour. Both pulled their accounts the same afternoon, citing material misrepresentation of firm assets. By end of business Friday, the North Carolina Secretary of State's Securities Division had opened a formal inquiry into Fosse Capital advisors. Damon called a family meeting that weekend. Not a dinner. A meeting, his parents' house, kitchen table, voices low. He laid out the numbers without the performance for once. The call notice, the liquidity gap, the disclosure, the inquiry. His mother pressed her hands flat on the table. His father was very still. They pulled $45,000 from their retirement account by Monday. Brianna contributed $12,000. She transferred it from the savings account she had been building for 2 years, using the budgeting spreadsheet Terence had built for her, the one she still opened every Sunday morning, the one organized in the clean, precise way of a man who had thought carefully about her financial future, even when she had not thought carefully about his. She did not make the connection. Not yet. The Charlotte Business Chronicle ran the item on a Tuesday, 7 sentences. The headline read, Fosse Capital Advisors Under State Securities Review. It appeared in the business brief section below the fold, between a restaurant opening and a commercial real estate transaction. 7 sentences was enough. By Thursday, Damon's 2 remaining corporate clients had begun what their representatives called a review of their portfolio relationships. His administrative assistant stopped showing up after that Friday. She did not call to explain. The office on East Trade Street, with 19 months left on a 3-year lease, sat increasingly quiet. Then Brianna's phone rang on a Wednesday afternoon, and the building manager's name appeared on the screen. She almost did not answer. When she did, the building manager explained, with the practiced neutrality of someone who has had this conversation before, that the leaseholder had given formal notice of vacating. He confirmed that the lease was held solely under Terence Lawson's name. He asked if she needed information about the timeline. 60 days. She sat on the couch Terence had picked out in the apartment Terence had signed for, and tried to identify a single document in the place that had her name on it. The utilities were in her name, everything else was his. The lease, the renter's insurance, the parking spot, the mailbox registration. She had lived there for 14 months inside a life someone else had built and signed for, and she had never once asked to see the paperwork. She called Damon. Damon told her he could not help her right now. She had never heard those words from her brother. Not in that order, not with that flatness in his voice. The voice of a man who has used up his performance and has nothing left underneath it but exhaustion. She stayed on the phone for a moment after he said it, waiting for the correction, for the pivot, for the energy to return. It did not return. She texted Terence that night. She had been texting for days. Casual at first, then less so, and now with a directness she had never used with him before because she had never needed to. He read every message. He responded to none. On the 4th night, she opened LinkedIn on her phone. She typed his name into the search bar, the name she had said 100 times in 3 years without ever once wondering what it was attached to beyond the apartment, beyond the Sunday dinners, beyond the steady, quiet man she had spent 3 years failing to look at directly. His firm came up immediately, licensed CPA, private investment consulting. The address was 3 miles from where she was sitting. She stared at the screen for a long time. Then she put on her coat. because there was no other move left. She found the office on a Tuesday morning. The building was 3 miles from the apartment she was about to lose, on a street she had driven down 100 times without ever reading the directory in the lobby. She had typed his name into LinkedIn the night before with the particular desperation of someone who has run out of other options, and his profile had appeared immediately. Clean, sparse, professional. Licensed CPA, private investment consulting. The address was right there, available to anyone who had ever thought to look. She had never thought to look. She pushed through the glass doors at 10:15 and stopped. His name was on the wall in raised silver letters, Terence J. Lawson, Investment Consulting, mounted at eye level on a panel of dark wood, clean and permanent, and completely serious. Not a nameplate, not a placard. The kind of signage you commission when you have been in a space long enough to know you are staying. She stood in front of it for a moment that stretched too long, and then she went to the front desk and asked for him. The receptionist told her she could have a seat. He would be with her when he was available. She sat for 20 minutes. She did not look at her phone. She sat with her hands in her lap and her coat still on, and she looked at the name on the wall the way you look at something you should have seen a long time ago. Terence came out to meet her himself. He was in a dark suit, no tie, the same calm surface he always wore. He did not look surprised to see her. He did not look anything in particular. He said her name once in greeting and led her back toward a small conference room off the main corridor. The room had a table, 4 chairs, a window that looked out over the street below. He sat across from her. He did not offer water. He did not ask why she had come. He folded his hands on the table, and he waited the way he had always waited, without impatience, without performance, without any indication that waiting cost him anything at all. Brianna looked at him for a long moment. Then she asked him why he had left without a word. He was quiet for just long enough that the silence had weight. "You know why?" he said. She said she needed to hear it. He looked at her steadily. "I came home on a Thursday. The door was unlocked. I heard you from the hallway. All of it. The question, your answer, the part about Damon, the part about men like me always landing somewhere." He paused. "I was 12 feet away." The color changed in her face. She asked about Damon's firm, whether he was involved. "Yes," he said. She asked how. He told her about the callable notes, the LLC, the $890,000, the note agreement Raymond had drafted 7 years ago, the account identifier he had recognized on the wall at the happy hour. He said it the same way he would say anything true, without decoration, without emphasis, just the facts laid out in the order they had occurred. She asked if he had known about the connection since the happy hour. "Yes," he said again. She asked why he had never told her, and here he slowed down. Not because he was searching for the words. He had known what he would say since before she walked through the door, but because this part deserved to be said at the right pace, so that every word arrived separately and was understood before the next one followed. "Because I was watching," he said, "to see if you would ever decide I was worth knowing. Not worth tolerating, not worth keeping around because I was steady and showed up on time and handled the things that needed handling. Worth knowing. The difference matters, Brianna. It is the whole difference." She opened her mouth. He continued, "I watched your brother use my name as a punchline at every dinner table for 3 years, and I watched you let him because his opinion was the one that mattered to you. I watched you tell your friends on a video call that you would rather be in the ground than build a life with me. I was standing in the hallway. I was right there, and I realized in that moment that there was nothing left to wait for because you had already told me everything I had been watching to find out." The room was very quiet. You told your friends you would rather be in the ground than marry me, he said. I was standing in the hallway, so I left. Quietly, completely, and with everything that mattered. Turns out the only thing I forgot to take was the floor your brother's whole life was built on. Brianna did not cry. What happened to her face was quieter than crying and harder to recover from. It was the specific expression of a person who has just understood something they cannot undo. Not shock, not anger, recognition. The slow, devastating arrival of a truth that had been available the entire time if she had ever thought to look for it. She said his name. Just his name, like she was trying it out for the first time and finding that it meant something different now. He waited. She did not have another question after that. There was nothing left to ask because he had answered everything, and the answers were not the kind that left room for negotiation or appeal. She sat with her coat still on and her hands in her lap, the same way she had sat in the waiting room, except that now the thing she was sitting with was the weight of her own choices, and there was no receptionist's desk to look at instead. Terence stood. He pushed back his chair. He picked up the single legal pad he had brought into the room and tucked it under his arm. "Thank you for coming in," he said. He meant it simply and without cruelty, the way he meant most things. He walked to the conference room door and opened it. He did not watch her leave. He was already thinking about the email draft on his laptop, the one to the church on Beatty's Ford Road, about Saturday mornings, about the fellowship hall, about what he intended to build next. The conference room emptied out behind him. What Terence Lawson did with the victory would always matter more than the victory itself. Fossey Capital Advisors dissolved 4 months after the call notice was issued. There was no dramatic announcement. There was no press release. The firm simply stopped existing in the way that fraudulent things stop existing when the infrastructure beneath them is finally removed, quietly, completely, leaving nothing behind worth examining. Damon entered a civil settlement with 2 former clients whose positions had been liquidated without consent. He surrendered his securities registration to the North Carolina Secretary of State's office on a Tuesday morning and was out of the building by noon. The lease on the East Trade Street office ran for 19 more months. He paid it every month. The office sat empty. Brianna's parents spent the better part of the following year working to recover from the $45,000 they had pulled from their retirement account to prop up a firm that could not be saved. Leonard went back to working Saturdays. Gwen cut the family dinners from every Sunday to twice a month, and then to once, and then they became the kind of gatherings that people attend out of obligation rather than warmth. Damon's name, which had once filled every room he walked into, became the subject of a particular silence, the silence of a family that has learned too late the difference between a man who builds things and a man who performs building them. Brianna moved into a studio apartment on the east side of Charlotte. She paid her own rent, she signed her own lease, she opened her own spreadsheet and built her own budget from scratch, because the one Terence had made for her was still on a shared drive she no longer felt she had the right to access. She attended Christmas at her parents' house and sat at the table where Terence had once been tolerated and said very little. Nobody asked her about her plans. Terence used a portion of the recovered capital to do exactly what he had planned since before the call notice was ever filed. He approached the church on Beatty's Ford Road in late autumn, the one his grandmother had attended for 40 years, the one with the high windows that let in the morning light sideways across the fellowship hall floor. He spoke with the pastor, a measured man named Reverend Clifton Graves, who listened carefully and asked good questions and ultimately said yes before Terence had even finished explaining the budget. The partnership with the credit union came together in 6 weeks. The program was called simply the Saturday Workshop because Terence had no interest in naming things after himself. The first session was held on a cold morning in January. 43 people came, working families, young professionals, retirees who had spent decades saving without a clear framework for what their savings could become. Terence stood at a whiteboard in a room that smelled like old coffee and good wood polish and taught for 2.5 hours without a single piece of performance attached to any of it. He talked about callable instruments, about asset protection, about the difference between holding a note and holding a hope. He talked about paperwork in the way his mother had taught him to talk about paperwork, as if it were the most important thing because it was. The second session was 3 weeks later. A woman came in at 5 minutes to 9 and took the front row. She had a thermos of coffee, a legal pad covered in handwriting from top to bottom, and the particular focus of someone who had prepared for this the way you prepare for something that matters. She sat with her pen ready and did not look around the room because she was not there to be seen. She was there to learn. Her name was Portia. She taught economics at a high school on the north side of the city. She had found out about the workshop through the credit union newsletter and had arrived with 12 questions she had not gotten to ask at the first session, which she had not attended but whose notes she had obtained through a colleague who had. She stayed after the second session to ask all 12. Terence answered them one at a time, leaning against the whiteboard. No rush. She took notes on every answer. When he reached the end, he offered to send her the slide deck. She looked up from her legal pad. "I would rather just come back next week," she said. He said that worked. He drove home that Saturday afternoon through a Charlotte that looked exactly the same as it always had. The same streets, the same light, coming through the same trees, the same neighborhoods he had moved through for 34 years. But the quiet in the car was different from the quiet he had carried for the past 3 years. It did not have the weight of something being suppressed. It did not have the particular hollowness of a man waiting to be seen by someone who was never going to look. It was just quiet, his own, earned, because this is what the story of Terence Lawson teaches, if you are paying attention. A man who knows his worth does not need to announce it, does not need to perform it, and does not need anyone else's permission to live inside it fully. He simply continues, building, teaching, choosing correctly, until the world arranges itself around the truth he already knew. Now I want to hear from you. If you were in Terence's position, standing in that hallway, hearing everything, what would you have done? Would you have stayed and confronted her that night? Or would you have done exactly what he did? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button one more time before you go. It helps more people find stories like this one. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the time, because we are back next week with another story about quiet strength, hidden power, and the particular satisfaction of watching the truth arrive exactly on schedule. I will see you in the next one.